But we are both within the Rocky Mountain region and the Southwest region. So that really is covering the whole, what I believe is called the Southwest region within the USDA. And we have labeled our group the Actionable and Strategic Integrated Science and Technology, the ASSIST pilot project. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to assist researchers and stakeholders to connect together, to share their data, to advance their stakeholder needs, to co-produce the science, and to use advanced technology to propel the issues and to address the complex issues of drought is coming to me in a way that allows us to scale up data, to make data more usable across regions and across boundaries. And so, and I'll apologize, I forgot my thumb drive. And so if there are some messinesses in this PDF, that's my fault. We had to go smaller, so you'll have to excuse me. But oh, no, I can do this, I'll remember. So really, as we think about the ASSIST approach, we're really thinking about kind of 5 main tenets. And that includes building on this Earth Map pilot project. I don't know if you've heard about the Earth Map idea within the USGS. And this is really just thinking about stakeholder involvement, connecting science, and using advanced technology to be able to address complex issues. And so really we're here to develop foundational relationships, leverage resources and expertise, apply enterprise information to allow us to really identify how we can scale up data, and then to support efficient implementation across the USGS, because we are a diffuse matrix of researchers across the landscape, and sometimes we don't even know what we're doing in our own office, let alone what USDA is doing or BLM is doing, and that is a challenge. I think that we're really hoping to help reduce redundancies in some of the work that we're doing. So, oh, I keep doing that wrong, but that's okay. And so really, I think that the benefit of having the USGS kind of get streamlined within itself and then working with its agencies is really to help improve understanding. And this was one reason why we focused on the Colorado River Basin, because drought is such a complex problem. You know, it's like trying to measure, how do you measure drought? There are so many ways to get at measuring drought. Hydrologic drought is just one of them. We've heard a lot about it here. We're all experts on that, so I'm not going to go too deeply in that. But we recognize that USGS and focusing on drought could help to improve our understanding. And then applying this ASSIST pilot project ideas is that we can really start to integrate our science across disciplines and across our agencies and science centers and across other agencies. And so really the focus is making sure that we can only do so much if we work alone, but together we can really start to make and move this project forward, or move these ideas and solutions around drought forward. And so one of the things that the pilot project did in its first year, so we're in our almost ending our second year of being together, is start to identify who are our stakeholders. That's really a big question. Who are the people on the landscape, and how are they our different stakeholders? So the first thing, and this is to really help us leverage across the landscape, who are our stakeholders? So we started with our group. There's about 20 different people across 7 different science centers within the USGS. And we started to identify who are the people that we work with, who are the individuals, who are the agencies that we start to work with. And then we started to take those people and categorize them into different stakeholder types. And that's when we started to see holes. Oh, okay, we don't want to be biased here. We recognize that NGOs have a full spectrum of who is an NGO. And so we wanted to make sure that we represented agencies or organizations that we knew represented the full spectrum. So in the end, we don't have a comprehensive list, but we do have a list of about 150 different stakeholders that we want to engage with. And we categorize them into these 10 stakeholder types. Now, land ownership is just one type of stakeholder. And those are significant because they do help to implement rules and laws. They are dealing with the effects of drought. So these are a significant group of stakeholders. And you can see here on the map in the Colorado River Basin, they're a diverse group with a lot of competing needs and similar needs. And so this was just one way to really think about who are our stakeholders, and land ownership is one way to visualize who our stakeholders are, to identify how complex they are. So once we started to understand who our stakeholders are, just to identify them, then it was, we need to understand their interest and their influence so that we understand how to interact with them as we start to develop projects and pilot programs in how to address these issues of drought. And so when we talk about interest, we're really talking about the amount of involvement a stakeholder will have in the project, the size of the overlap between the stakeholder and the project's needs, as well as the stakeholder, are they a science consumer or a science practitioner? When we think about the influence, it's really about the expectations about how a project will proceed and the ability of a stakeholder to affect the project outcome and products. And so when we think about these, those stakeholders with high interest and high influence are going to be our co-producers. These guys are going to be our partners who are going to help us to collect data, to determine how our science tools will be used and disseminated. And then the full spectrum all the way down to the outreach, where we're letting those with low interest and low influence, but are still interested in knowing what we're doing. And so once we identify our interest and influence in our stakeholders, and I do want to make sure that it's an interesting problem, because when we think about drought, and this is the same thing, we looked at this as like the large scale across the whole Colorado River Basin. But when you start to think about specific questions in a specific space, that interest and influence of a specific stakeholder can change. Some stakeholders will have very high interest and high influence about a very specific question. But when you think about drought, it may be kind of in the gray area. So this is an important aspect of making sure that we think about these with a specific science question in mind. But what we do want to do is make sure that we then know how to engage with our stakeholders. And so this model was developed to help us understand the different levels of engagement and how we can make sure to have participation with the right level of interest and influence. And so you'll recognize the outreach. This is really where we're talking about how we will inform stakeholders about our work or about our findings. And then it's really a spectrum that goes all the way up to co-production, where these are the groups that are going to be in the room planning the projects, helping to collect the data, helping to disseminate the data. And based on the question, they'll move up and down this spectrum. And it definitely is something that there should be fluidity. Some will be self-selection, some will be they're necessary to accomplish a project. They must be involved at a much higher level. And so these are some of the things that we have to think about, is how do we engage them at different levels? And then also we want to think about what activities do we do to engage them. And so as we think about the outreach here in the orange, these are the ones that we're giving information. And as we move down the spectrum, it's more about both giving and receiving information and taking that information in to help build relationships, but also to help build science projects. But you also can see that time increases as you increase participation. And so this is really just a conceptual way of thinking. You have to really identify who's going to be your stakeholders, but you also have to have them identify they want to be a co-producer, because it takes a lot of time for them to be involved, as well as it does from our perspective and their perspective. So then we also wanted to think within this framework is that we really are looking for adaptive management, meaning this is an iteration. We have to go through and get feedback from our stakeholders. One, to go through the first stage, which is to understand the engagement interests. Are you interested in being involved with us on a specific science question? And what are your objectives? We get feedback from the stakeholders to move into the second, to refine our needs, establish our goals and objectives. But we get feedback from that to then help us move into the project administration and implementation. Who's going to take on the roles and responsibilities within this co-production relationship to develop and implement the science? And then finally, we take back that feedback and get back into the evaluate, determine how did the co-production go? What can we learn from it? How can we grow from it? Did we really give enough time to the communication effort, to the cross information sharing effort? But then you always have to be careful of scope creep, right? Because you have projects that need to get done. And when you get in a room with high thinkers, big thinkers, new projects always come about. So that's where we want to make sure that we're always feeding into this understanding new or revisited collaboration efforts. It's always an iterative process with feedback being the core. So this is really what we talk about when we talk about co-production, is making sure that it's iterative, that we're always incorporating feedback, but we're staying within the scope so that we can actually get the project done. So the other thing, now that we know who our stakeholders are, now that we know how we want to engage with them, then the next thing that the pilot did was try to ascertain what are the stakeholder needs, what are their science needs related to drought. And one thing that I really thought of, and I've heard people talk here about this, is that, man, we've been listening. We have been listening for like 20 years. What do stakeholders need? And so the innovative part of this project was really to say, instead of going back to do a listening session, let's evaluate what they've already told us. What have they already told us in the last 10 years about what their needs are, those 146 stakeholders and their agencies? What have they already told us? And so what we did was kind of a literature review approach. We went and reviewed over 200 recent web pages, mission statements, conference proceedings, memorandums of understanding, all of those pieces to try to identify what are the stakeholders already telling us are their science needs related to drought. And in that, we identified over 480 stakeholder science needs from those different publications. And from those science needs, we started to classify them by science theme. And so this is where we're talking about groundwater and surface water or geologic setting. What are the science themes related to the specific stakeholder need that was identified? And in this classification, we started to see that on average, every science need had at least 3 unique science topics, science themes, and as many as 6. And so what we see is not only can we identify the priorities from what we were identifying from the science needs, which the biggest one is surface and groundwater. Next, we go to human, flora, fauna, atmosphere. These are the science themes that were identified. But when we look at the next chart, the bar chart, we see these are the different science. On the bottom, you see the science, the stakeholder types listed on the bottom. And you really see that all of the stakeholder types are identifying that an integrated science strategy is necessary to really make inroads to addressing the complex issues of drought. And so it was really, not only do we see that an integrated science approach is necessary, but we also see that the stakeholder types have similar needs. They're sharing the same needs. They're sharing that the groundwater and surface water is a primary topic for understanding drought. And so when we are able to address one stakeholder science needs, we're likely able to address many stakeholder science needs. And understanding that connection was really important part of the work. So then we take the science needs that we've identified at this science themes level, and we started to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. And what we did was we took all of the science needs that we found, all 480 of them, and we started to assign very specific words that addressed the science topic. And we use the USGS thesaurus terms because it's very important that we all came to a common ontology. We wanted to say, okay, I understand that one group uses hydrologic vulnerability and says the word in a different way than maybe another group uses it. So we wanted to make sure that we brought all of them into one word that meant the same thing. And so we use the USGS thesaurus as a way to get everybody's needs into one common language. And what we found when we take these science topics is that there's a broad array of science needs and science topics that relate to specific science topics. In general, we found that every science need had on average 6 different science topics that it needed to be addressed. And there were over 76 science topics that were identified through this data set. And so what we see is that there's a lot of the word cloud is helping us to identify those with bolder or larger font. Say those were the words most commonly used. I'm also displaying it in a bar chart so you can see the most commonly used and then moving up. These are just the top like 12 or so. And we're really looking at related to atmospheric and climatic processes, land use changes in habitats, stream flow, hazards such as wildfires. these are the topics that really we're finding are the challenges that the stakeholder science needs are addressing. So from there, we decided within the USGS to do some collaboration meetings. And really, this was just an internal dialogue with over 75 attendees representing about 20 centers. We had 12 different science and technology workshops where it was a whiteboarding exercise specifically addressed to each of these. And you can see the different topics. The one I was most interested in, of course, was the groundwater dependent ecosystems. That's kind of my baby for decades now. But I also was interested in the impacts of drought on the human system and many other topics, including technology topics like artificial learning and machine learning. So we started to have these conversations within our internal organizations to be able to expand our connections, to say, oh, I didn't even know you were doing that work. We all got together and we started to say, oh man, there are people in Colorado and there are people in Utah that are actually working in the same space. We didn't even know. And that was very helpful because now we can start to expand our reach and expand our scale to be able to do more comprehensive work. So with that, we took all of these whiteboarding activities and we were asking across those 12 different science and technology meetings. And we asked, it was mostly a brainstorming session looking at challenges, knowledge gaps, capabilities, strategies and actions, example applications, and identifying next steps related to those 12 different science topics. And when people would put up a whiteboard sticky note, you could get thumbs up from other participants to try to show how often people were agreeing with, yes, that is a challenge, like understanding what type of information stakeholders and decision makers need most and in what form. For this moment, the challenges, that was the highest challenge that was identified by the whole group. Or how to, I have to read, quantify, model, and communicate feedback mechanisms as the system changes in response to drought and management actions. I mean, I think everybody here is like, yeah, those are definitely needs. So it was important for us within the USGS to get on that page to make sure, okay, we all understand what our priorities are, where are our challenges, where are our knowledge gaps, but also where are our capabilities. So we took all of these responses and started to analyze them to say, okay, if we look across the landscape of these 12 science and technology meetings, what are the challenges and knowledge gaps that this group identified? And what are our capabilities to be able to address these knowledge gaps? So we can say knowledge gaps were climate, groundwater, impact, change, drought, but our capabilities are to integrate, that we do study drought, that we have science and models, that we are a community, we monitor. These are some of the ways that we are able to identify that we can address some of these knowledge gaps with our current capabilities. Then we took it another step and we said, okay, so then how do we apply this to the stakeholder science needs, questions? How do we link together our challenges that we identified within the USGS to the broader stakeholder needs assessment? And then how do we say, well, these are our capabilities to address these? And this is where we're at right now. So we're really trying to fine tune how we can get in to address and take our capabilities and specifically address these science needs. So one thing that we did find is that we go back to this grouping of our top science elements that were a question. And we say in green, this is where we identified that both overlapping with our understanding from within the USGS and our stakeholder needs assessment. This is where our capabilities and where our focus should handle currently. And then the gray helps us to identify where maybe some of the redundancies are, or maybe where some of our gaps are. So this is really a way to help us map across our questions and our capabilities. So really a path forward is integration, working with stakeholders. Now it's time to open the doors a bit and not just focus on our internal capabilities, but really start to get down into specific science topics, specific science questions with specific stakeholders to see if we can't bridge some of these questions and identify some more of our capabilities. So one thing we did learn is that there are different stages that these science projects are in that are helping to address some of these science topics. We understand that there are some science that needs to be developed, that we need to initiate the science. This is the largest gap. As an example, groundwater dependent ecosystems. There is not a national program for understanding groundwater dependent ecosystems and how they're being affected by changes in drought. There isn't that. There's a lot of diverse work and isolated work going on, but how do we get a comprehensive project working? There's also different stages of accelerating science or enhancing science, and wildfires would be a very specific example, is that we need to accelerate our science to understand what are the impacts of wildfire, say on water quality, how do we predict where wildfires will be, and the severity of those wildfires. But then we also need to think about sustaining those large efforts that already are established, but they need to be sustained, such as understanding federally listed fishes. So these are some of the ways that we learned how to categorize and to accelerate the work that needs to be done and to continue to propel the work that needs to be done. So we really have got this iteration going within the USGS where we identify our stakeholders, we identify the science topics, we have topical workshops internally to understand our capacity. Then we start to go out and work with stakeholders, understand how we can mesh our capabilities with their needs, and then facilitate the science, co-produce the science, and then start again and keep going and keep going. And I know you guys have heard me talk a little bit about the saline lakes work, that this is one of these projects that's helping us. Right now, we're at the Facilitate Stakeholder Topical Workshops. We're holding 3 workshops this summer in the Great Salt Lake area, in the Reno area, and in the Southeast Oregon area. And this is really going to be about integrating our work with the stakeholders to identify co-producers, understand science priorities, and see if we can't come up with some solutions for land and resource managers. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think there were supposed to be questions and answers if there are any.
Yeah, I was gonna.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We have some time for question and answers if there are any.
Sorry.
I was just thinking, like, what time we should wrap up. Maybe can we take 10 minutes, Emily? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll take 10.
That'll just make our team meetings shorter. Is everyone feeling solid on what they're planning on doing? No. Okay.
We lost half our time because we lost our connection.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
So how about 5 minutes?
maybe 5 minutes.
There may not be any questions. That's okay.
Are there any questions for Rebecca? Russ?
I'll ask one. Can you go back to the slide where you had like the breakdown of who the stakeholders were? I kind of didn't quite catch all of that. And I guess that was sort of my overall question here too, is just, which I know you talked about a bit, because this is mostly like organization level folks, right? Not like the public, the general public, so to speak. And I don't know if that's something you're kind of thinking about doing or how to, I guess, right? That would be the people in the lower left of your little quadrant.
Yeah, so I think,
extent.
yeah, no, I really appreciate that. When we talked about the public, in this perspective, when we're kind of looking at the 3,000 viewpoint, we put them in the other. But we did the same exercise for say like the saline lakes, and the public, particularly landowners and water rights owners, they're not necessarily in the low interest, low influence, because they specifically own the water that is in a way being used away from the saline lakes. And so this is where it becomes really important to identify not just at this 3,000 viewpoint, but really get in and understand who are our stakeholders. And so for the saline lakes, we actually have, I think it's like 13 different categories of stakeholder types. Hi.
Can you go ahead 2 slides?
Like
one,
this?
yeah, that one right
Yeah.
there. So is the goal, so the levels of engagement for all those stakeholders, they're going to be different, or is the goal to kind of get down to that outreach component for all of them?
Thank you. So all of the stakeholders will have the outreach component, but There will be a few that will go all the way up to the co-production, and there'll be some in between. So that's where it's really important to understand, like some of the landscape of some of the stakeholders will be kind of medium interest and medium influence. And that's where they're going to be participants. They'll provide feedback on kind of the main salient points of the project rather than just hearing about the project. Or they will become more important elements of the science plan will run past them. Like if it specifically addresses their land, you know, they have to be much more involved than just at the outreach level. And so it really does depend on who the stakeholder is and the question that you're asking.
Did you make that figure?
I did.
Can I have it?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. It's I'm in review.
Okay.
But it did come out on a we did a 2-page flyer that just released yesterday.
Oh, cool.
So and it's on there.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, Joel.
Any lessons learned as you've gone through this whole process? If you were to start at the beginning again, was there something that you would do differently?
You know, I think that we could iterate longer, but you could always do that on who our stakeholders are. I think that it's important. I think we did, I don't know. That sounds terrible. There's always lessons learned. We could have spent longer on identifying science needs. Like, but that you could always go on forever and
I guess you
ever.
got to draw a line somewhere.
Yeah. But I really did like this idea because what I think we're doing is instead of going and saying, well, let me hear your science needs, we're now coming to the stakeholders to say, we already heard you say these 480 things. I've already established what I think are your priorities. Let's talk about that now. Not tell me what all your ideas. No, I think I understand your top 10 priorities. Am I missing something? Would you prioritize them in a different way? That's what I think was really great about this project is that I hate to say this. I'm not tired of listening, but I'm tired of only listening. I want to see action.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.